This is ThinkTech Hawaii. Community matters here.
Hello, I'm Michael North. Welcome to another episode of Asia Pacific Business Strategies. I'm going to talk today a little bit about an experience that I had recently in Shanghai. Shanghai in south central China, the largest city in the world, 24 million people. I looked it up right now. New York is clocking in at just under 9 million people officially. So Shanghai is unbelievably massive, but that's not the significant thing about it. A lot of people, they stop when they think how massive China is. 1.4 billion people, and all the massive infrastructure and manufacturing and so on that they have. But there's a much more important story, and that's why I was in Shanghai. About 7 years ago at APEC, those of us who are here in Honolulu may remember the Asia Pacific Economic Conference that was held in Honolulu when all the presidents and prime ministers of the Asia Pacific nations came, including Barack Obama and Putin and the Chinese leaders at the time. During that event, we announced the formation of a nonprofit organization called the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute. And by we, I mean my wife and I, Zhou Xiaofang, who is associated with the family of Zhou Enlai in China. She's the grandniece of Zhou Enlai. So the idea was Zhou Enlai as a statesman and as a peacemaker and one who represented the intelligentsia of the young China is one of the most responsible and respected leaders of China. So if you're looking to understand modern China, with all the hurly-burly that goes on there, something that takes you back to their roots, back to the source, to part of their identity that they identify with very closely, then Zhou Enlai is a good place to start. So the genesis of my meeting in Shanghai started way back then when we, working through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the equivalent of the State Department in the central government in Beijing, we established this Zhou Enlai Peace Institute, and representatives of the ministry came and were part of it. So through those intervening years, we've maintained a set of quite diverse relationships with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and most recently with the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, which was the organization within the ministry that helped to create APEC way back in the early 1980s. So it's really about cultural connection, economic development, trade, and intergovernment relations that APEC is established. As a result of all of that work, one of the publishers in China, we've also developed a relationship with, they invited me, representative of the Zhou Enlai Peace Institute, to go to Shanghai to sit down with a group called the Shanghai Academy. So if you just enter en.shanghaiacademy.org into your search bar, you will see the English version of the website. Shanghaiacademy.org gives you the Chinese version of the website. Very interesting group. I'll just go into a little bit of detail about how they were formed, because China is a very productive society. They're very highly organized, but they're organized on virtually completely different basis than in America. Their presumptions, their assumptions are quite different from the ones that we're used to here in America for forming organizations and providing management and thought and consensus building and so on. This one is interesting because it was formed by a unit of one of the central government ministries. They're called the China Association for Social Services. And they come from the central government, from the federal level, and they were also formed by the city of Shanghai. So they come from the grassroots level, and they were formed within Shanghai University, a group of several hundred academics and teachers and researchers, scientists, multidisciplinary, and their purpose is to build the the presence of Shanghai and by extension of the whole country across the world. So to make relationships civil level relationships, not official diplomatic relationships, that's handled by the diplomats. But their role is to form relationships between associations that people like us, like a little nonprofit organization in Honolulu, can connect with matching organizations in China. So they asked us to come and sit down and talk to some of their leading academics about the basic tenor and tone of relationships between America and China. They are very concerned. At this juncture, here we are in mid-December 2018. There's been almost 2 years of disruption of communication and perception of expectations and promises made and given and said and unstated and so on. I'm not making any judgments about that, about where it's come from and from whom and why. I'm just stating a fact of the perception of the people in China, that after decades of America being a relatively consistent voice on the world stage and having leadership in key areas, that it's highly respected by the Chinese and by everyone. There's been a change in that momentum, in that direction. And suddenly, America has become somewhat unpredictable to China. And they're seeking to hear from ordinary Americans, what's going on? Who are you? What's happening? Where are we going? We really value our relationship between China and America, both official and unofficial. We believe that there's a tremendous amount of growth and good that can proceed from that relationship. And we want to hear from ordinary people your perspective on where the relationship stands. So it's a big responsibility for just an ordinary businessman from Honolulu to speak at that level. But I did my best to provide a service to the people from my own point of view, not representing anything official from any government organization here, just representing the views and the feelings, the understandings from a small circle of friends here in Honolulu and our corresponding friends in China and all over the country, and from recent experiences that we've had at the United Nations and presenting ideas about relations with China on that world stage. So we began with a sort of a historical review, and as probably everyone knows, starting in 1949, when the People's Republic of China became an independent nation, there was almost a total blackout of communications between the United States and China. There had been quite vigorous communications and relationships and even alliances before that between China and America. But as a result of the formation of the new government, there was almost a complete blackout. There was no diplomatic relations. There were no visas, no passports. It was very rare for someone from China to come to America or from someone from America to go to China. It was very difficult to arrange. And so for a long time, that ignorance, that blackout, turned into a kind of a wariness and a hostility even between America and China. And there was, of course, the war that was taking place in between North and South Korea, in which they were adversaries. So there was a long time when there was almost a complete shadow over the relations between the US and China. And of course, China at that time was nothing like they are today. They were a developing nation. There were people who were hungry. Their industries were just beginning to develop. Their healthcare systems were not well distributed, although they had strong traditional medicine and so on. But China was standing up on its own. as a united nation for the first time. And until 1972, when there was a breakthrough between America and China that was a result of what I think is one of the most courageous acts that we've seen in diplomacy in a long, long time. And that was a visit by President Richard Nixon of America to China to visit with Mao Zedong. It was a time when there was almost no context, no acceptable framework for such a meeting. Both sides were taking a huge risk, and the risk was brokered by or buffered by two figures. On the American side, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and on the Chinese side, Premier Zhou Enlai, who was also, for some time, had been the foreign minister and was really in charge of all of the foreign relations between China and the rest of the world. And there's a famous photograph that you probably have seen where Richard Nixon comes down the jetway of Air Force One as it's parked on in the main airport in Beijing and shakes the hand of Zhou Enlai. So that was a handshake that was heard around the world. And even though it was small, and even though the meetings over the subsequent week did not achieve much in terms of substantive agreements, what they did was they showed that there was the potential for communication, that there was the potential for these two huge nations to have a productive conversation, and even from the Shanghai communique, even just an agreement to disagree. Here's who we are and where we stand on the following critical issues of the day, and here's where we stand and our opinion, and we see each other. It's clear what those opinions are, and there's some areas where we can maybe agree. There's also large areas where we disagree, but we resolve to try to begin a dialogue. And that was really profound. And even though the step itself was very small and even inconsequential in actual terms, over the next 7 years, the countries got closer and closer until in 1979 there were official diplomatic relations. So we went from a period of darkness to a period of contact. And then in 1979, when President Carter and Deng Xiaoping of China signed the agreement to open diplomatic relations, there was a sudden and very powerful surge of interest and contact. It was now possible for people to go back and forth. And America was very interested in investing in China because they recognized, the far-sighted companies recognized that with a huge and growing population and a beginning of an economic coalition that was taking place in China, that China was beginning to grow, that it was one of the most productive fields of investment through the 1980s. So through much of the 1980s and into the 1990s, a great many American companies and European and international companies of all kinds entered an investment phase in China. There were a lot of joint ventures then created because China had assets and America had assets, and they found a way to match those assets. But it was still very much in the mold of America's assets sort of drawing the Chinese assets out and creating something that was of joint importance. And of course, America was still very much seen and recognized as being the #1 economy in the world, and China was in learning mode. So let's call there was a period of investment and learning and joint ventures. And then another real turning point was in 2008 with the Beijing Olympics, when China finally had achieved a status where they were in the race. They were getting larger and more effective, and they had introduced some elements of capitalism into their economic methods as early as 1972. But the foundation was laid for where things were going to go. And by 2011, China passed Japan and became the #2 economy in the world. So I think you can see where these trends are going, and we'll have a short break, and I'll come back after the break and start to connect the dots for you.
This is ThinkTech Hawaii, raising public awareness.
You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, or brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You.
Okay, so let's connect some dots. Now we're up to 2011, and in the past nearly a decade, China has more than asserted itself as a competitor, and there's been a period of competition between America and China. And that competition has been productive, it's been positive, and there's been more and more, for the first time, investment by China into America, acquiring assets in America, because China recognizes that America is a very productive field for investment. And America has been investing more and more in China. So now we have a lot of multinational companies, like, for example, Ford and General Motors. They make more cars in China than they do in the United States. And they make them there. And a big part of their international business is based on the growth and the relative harmony between China and America. So it's very important that the #1 and #2 economies of the world, which have somewhat different political and social systems and have different views of key issues, it's very important that there be strong lines of communication between those two. So what we did at the Shanghai Academy was we reviewed all of that, and we said, okay, given that trend that we can see, what is the next step? Because we all felt, especially over the past 2 years of relative disruption in that pattern, we all felt that there was an opportunity for some profound change. That in the questioning and so on of assumptions on both sides, that there was an opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, if we could design this thing how we both want it to be, then what would that design be? And over the period of time that I was there, almost 4 days, we came up with the idea that the new relationship needs to be based on the assumption of equality between America and China. In some areas, China has leaped ahead of America, and you can read about it in the press every day. In some cases, America retains its natural advantages over China. But all in all, if you take them as a whole, in many ways, China and America are equal and can deal with each other on the basis of mutual respect. So the idea of creating new relationships that are based not on one investing on the other or taking over the other or helping the other, but that are based purely on where the natural advantages and needs of the two parties could best be optimized. That was felt to be, the reciprocal model was felt to be one that could be very powerful. And we went over a number of possible examples of how that could work. Let me share with you one of those that we discussed. One of the great challenges to both industrial growing economies, US and China, and really around the world, is cancer. Cancer is a health scourge that touches virtually every family. And when we started talking about this, I went around the table in Shanghai and every hand went up when I said, has your family been touched in any way by cancer? The cancer rates are going up there and they're going up here with tremendous suffering and loss of dignity, loss of family members and continuity, loss of economic productivity, loss of all the expenses that we throw into treatments trying to keep people healthy, keep them alive, even up to the very last minute. It's a tremendous drain on every part of our social, economic, and cultural systems. So we do know from current science that progress has been made toward what could be actually a cure for cancer. But we know that there are many types of cancers and so many different types of cures. We also know that the genetic makeup of a person determines the type of treatment that will work with them, and that a liver cancer here would be treated very differently from a liver cancer there. So it's not something simple like finding a vaccine for polio. You get that one vaccine and you get it distributed and all of a sudden polio becomes extinct. Cancer is not simple like that. There is no one cancer, in other words. So it requires a confluence of three very important fields. Big data, a lot of data about populations, their genetic makeup, their health history. It requires artificial intelligence to analyze it, and it requires genetic science to do the mapping of the genomes and to extract from an understanding of those genomes what the appropriate treatment can be for a particular cancer. At the theoretical level, we know this, but the obstacles to implementing it are huge. So where could solutions come? Well, they could come from the genetic scientists in both the US and China, which are both very advanced, but in different ways. They could come from the big data operations of companies like IBM and Tencent, who operate some of the biggest data operations in the world. And they could come from the artificial intelligence research. You know, AI was really born in America in the 50s and 60s, but in the last 10 years, artificial intelligence researchers in China have gone a long, long way towards creating automated self-modifying code that can create artificial intelligence and analyses of tremendously complex sets of data and come up with solutions. So what if the rhetorical question in Shanghai was, what if we brought the best scientists, the best data management people, and the best geneticists together from America and China? What if we brought some people from China to centers in America, some people from America to centers in China, and we established a formal, what we called a moonshot goal. And the Chinese immediately understood what I meant when I said a moonshot. You know, it's a formal goal, it's an impossible goal, it can't be accomplished, we don't know even how to approach it, we don't know all the details of how to make it happen, but we set a deadline for an enterprise, and we set for the solution to cancer, we could set 20 years as the time when cancer could be cured. So there's a great deal of excitement about that idea and about how that idea can unfold the potential for other types of collaborations. For example, in energy and environment, in taking up one big city and taking it off the grid, and exploring all the different confluences of renewable technologies and recycling and so on that would be required to take a big Chinese city, a big industrial city, or a big American industrial city, or both together, completely off the grid, and function with green renewables entirely, to serve as a model for the rest of the economies and for the world. That's another sort of moonshot kind of effort that only China and America could undertake together. So the outcome of those meetings in Shanghai was very positive, and one of the requests was for some ideas to come from Hawaii, because they recognize that Hawaii has a great deal of assets. and they feel comfortable about Hawaii because it's so close geographically. It's midway between the two continents. And there's a good, strong Chinese community, so they feel comfortable being here, a strong history of friendship. And maybe utilizing events between universities, businesses, government, and so on in Hawaii and in Shanghai to begin practicing some of these new moves based on the reciprocal model. So we're very excited to see how this turns out, and have had some productive meetings here in Honolulu since I got back about 10 days ago. We've been having some really productive meetings with some leaders here and reflecting those conclusions back to Shanghai. It's all in the mix right now, but I thought it would be interesting to give you just a little sneak preview of what may be developing there. If you want to follow progress on this issue, you can go to the website zhouenlaipeaceinstitute.org, where there's reports taking place, and there's some video about Shanghai Academy if you're interested in seeing that, and about Shanghai itself and the beginnings of this new relationship between the two largest economies in the world. And we really, this time of which many people see quite correctly as one of crisis, and where there are misunderstandings and people say and do things that they don't know exactly what the consequences are going to be. And then there's reactions on the other side. And there can be a buildup, a chain reaction that can take place. Just events in the last couple of weeks. We have to have institutions that allow us to have patient and understanding communication between these two groups, just for the sake of national security for both countries, and for the sake of our economic development, and ultimately for the sake of peace. This is what it's all about for the Chinese, Heping. That is the ultimate goal of every activity that they undertake, is to build the foundations of peace. And bringing it all back home again, they rely on the vision of Zhou Enlai, who's their peacemaker, to provide them with guidance on how to make peace. And they respect his example. He's more or less the Martin Luther King of China, as we respect Dr. King as an example of peace and nonviolence and equality and justice. They respect Zhou Enlai for the same reasons in their society. So from time to time, we'll provide some updates on the developments in this area, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to share them with you today. Season's greetings, aloha.